Right, here we go. Let's talk about the trauma nobody names, acts of omission, and the comparison. It's I gave this talk at the Guild because they asked me to speak on trauma at the last minute. So I said, let's do this. It's a little bit different. But as always, let's reset our reticular activating system, which the questions you ask yourself makes your brain do different things. So what can you learn new today? How can you apply this personally and professionally? Okay? And can you relearn something you already know, but in a new way? When we talk about trauma, those of us in this field, it's like, yeah, there's this. And can you be surprised and delighted today? Cool. So let's talk about two invisible wounds. There's the trauma we always talk about and the two that we don't, right? And the trauma we always talk about is, we'll get to, is like acts of commission and omission. And that's what we'll be going over today. And then we'll also go into the comparison thing, which can be traumatic. And so, and it's going to be fun. Hold on a second. Why is my thing going? Hold on. The thing just froze. All right. Hold on a second. Why is my computer acting? All right. Hold on. There we go. Now, all right. And just, I always put this in there because I'm going to use this on social media and this might get in there. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. I've been doing the hypnosis, the NLP for pretty close to 40 years. Been around it for a long time and really enjoy it. And it's changing. So let's talk about the trauma we talk about, the two that we don't. Generally, we talk about trauma. Thing that comes out to most people is post-traumatic stress disorder, things like combat, assault, accidents, and this is what seems to come to mind, right? Something happened to you, right? Like you say, combat situation. You had an accident, could have been a victim of a crime, just bad stuff like this, right? And it deserves all the attention it gets, but it's not the only one, right? There are two that are rarely named, and that's the ones we'll be talking about, right? And again, the commission is something happened to you. You were assaulted, you were abused, physically abused, things like that, right? But then there's the act of omission. Something you needed never came, and this can be usually the something happened to you is a single event or an incident that might have been a few events, but over a shorter period of time. But omission is when you're not getting the love, care, and nurturing that you needed, and it could be chronic, spread out over time, and it's just as bad, right, if not worse. And the trauma of omission, it's what didn't happen. It's not the blow that landed. It's not the hand that hit you. It's the hand that never reached out, right? It's not what the caregiver, did. It's what they didn't do. There wasn't the attunement, the comfort, the noticing. You matter, right? And it can be taken in a couple of different ways. I was watching a video. I think it was Gabor Mate, and he was talking to a big social media person, and she was sharing about being, sexually abused when she was young by someone, and about working through it. And he made a statement that at the time I just kind of like, well, what's he talking about? But then the longer I thought about it, it made sense. He goes, the real trauma wasn't just that you were abused. The real trauma is you had no one you could trust to tell that to. Because he said, did you tell your mother or your father or, somebody? And she didn't. And that, and I'm like, oh, okay. He didn't, there wasn't the support that you needed, right? And it's just as bad. It's emotional neglect, right? Clinical thing, they call it childhood emotional neglect, right? And sometimes it's almost like the kid gets treated or the young person as a burden, not worth responding to, right? Because it's invisible, unmemorable. It's just the absence of something, right? And it happens in homes where everything looks okay from the outside, right? You see a lot of abuse, of course, in addicted homes or homes where someone is truly mentally ill. But what happens in homes where they're self-absorbed, narcissistic, or just don't have the skill set to give the nurturing that you need? Example is let's say, and I had this happen, is a kid was in school and he got teased. It happens in school, probably second grade. So it's what, about 8? We could ask Michelle, somewhere around that, right? And was humiliated and crying, held it in all day, comes home, starts crying to tell his mother to get some love, care, and nurturing and, the stuff you need when that happens. Well, the mom, after I was working with the guy, he goes, I don't blame her because looking back on it, he had a little brother or sister. He had a baby, a baby sibling that was sick. He goes, I didn't know at the time, but my mom and dad were having issues. There was financial issues. She was at her wit's end. And so there he is, like spilling his guts out, wanting a hug, a kiss, some nurturing. And all she said is, oh, this shit's going to happen your whole life. Just grow up. Right. And, from that point on, he stopped sharing feelings with anyone. Right. Stop sharing feelings with anyone. Right. And so why it's invisible, right? It's just underneath the surface. And commission, leaves a memory you can point to. The firefight, the car wreck, the physical abuse, the accident, whatever it is, right? But omission, there's no scene, there's no necessary date, there's no incident. It's a feeling. As the current world in psychology would call it, it's a felt sense, right? And so it leads to feeling with things like, why shouldn't I feel happier? My life lacks meaning. I feel like I'm on the outside looking in and other people are truly living. Because when there's no memory to explain the feeling, the client or yourself will fill in the gap the only way they know how. They'll start blaming themselves. There's something wrong with me. I'm not good enough. I'm stupid. I'm not whatever it is. I'm not pretty enough. I'm not thin enough. I'm not talented enough, whatever it is, right? And so, you get the common patterns we see in adulthood is emptiness or numbness, right? Without being able to name what it is, right? Counterdependence. You don't want to rely on anyone for anything. It becomes its own identity. If you're familiar with the 12-step world, a lot of times people walking into the 12-step program have this issue. I'm not going to rely on anybody. Of course, people there are saying, get a sponsor, trust your therapist. This, nope, not do it. I'm going to do it myself. Right? And then it becomes self-directed anger, guilt, shame, guilt is usually something you did, but shame is basically something you felt, right? And so, and again, it turns into not that something bad happened to me, it's something is wrong with me. That's why it happened to me, right? And then you become difficulty, if at all, with any kind of self-compassion. You can be very generous with other people. Hey, you shouldn't feel this way. It's okay. You did a good job, blah, 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 blah. But with yourself, you'll say that to someone, then turn around and go, I'm so stupid. I can't do this. Why am I trying to do this, right? So that's the act of omission. And then I want to talk about the comparison trap. This is real big and currently and exploding. And it's been around since 1954 when it was basically broken down that comparing ourselves to others is a basic human drive. It's not a character flaw necessarily, but it's a mechanism to figure out where we stand in the hierarchy. We're we're group animals, tribe animals, pack animals, whatever we want to say. So you're trying to figure out where you are so you'll compare yourself with other people, right? And we compare because objective yardsticks are, for most of us, are what matters. Am I attractive enough? Am I successful? But in other people, become the yardstick, which may not be the best way, right? And there's two ways you could do it. There's an upward comparison and a downward comparison, right? If you downward, you compare yourself to someone worse, right? And it makes you feel better short term, right? And you do this when your self-esteem or your self-confidence, your self-worth is already under threat. And again, I default to recovery is someone with with an addiction problem. I may drink a lot, but I don't drink as bad as so and so. I've got a 1 DUI, but cousin Joe has 4 DUIs. So you're comparing yourself downward to make yourself feel better, right? But we have a lot of research shows that a lot of people have a dominant tendency to compare upwards, right? Comparing yourself to someone better. So, and in one way, it can motivate you to take action, right? Or it can deflate, depending on one thing, whether the gap is closable at all. Think about our world of, which I'll just call it coaching. The people that, well, I want to have so and so has it. I want $1 million practice. Coaching business. Well, usually they say coaching business. They won't say practice because if it's $1 million, they're not probably doing coaching, right? They're running a system. But anyway, but again, what happens when upward comparison backfires? There's a guy, Dr. Johnny Kim, went in the Navy right after high school, became a Navy SEAL on his first shot, which is rare, right? Usually you get hurt or you have to recycle most, but he made it through, became a SEAL, did something like 100 combat missions, operations. And because he saw all this, and it was at the beginning of this current or the last couple of wars, he saw all the carnage in it. And so he became a physician and I think a surgeon. And he went to Harvard Medical School. So he was a bright guy. I think he got his undergraduate degree at Stanford, then went to Harvard, right? So now he's a, former, Navy SEAL, combat trained Navy SEAL, chief petty officer. Then he becomes a physician. But wait, there's more. Then he becomes an astronaut, right? And to become an astronaut, he has to be a pilot. And he's one of the few people that, if he put his Navy uniform on, I think he's retired now, he would have his SEAL badge and true flight wings, right? Most people don't get that, right? So, I always say, how would you like to be his little brother, right? Well, your brother, it's like, if you ever had and sometimes it happens in families with multiple siblings, is what if one of the siblings is super successful, right? As an athlete, as a student, and you get compared to that. And then, of course, Michelle's favorite, David Goggins, Chief Goggins, went in the Air Force, became I think it was a pararescue guy, so their version of special forces, got out, gained all this weight, like 100-something pounds, then decided he wanted to be a SEAL, so he had to lose all that weight really quickly because he was hitting the cutoff date, went back in, and it took him 3 tries to make it through SEAL training, but he became a SEAL, right? And then while he was in SEAL school, they always send you to other schools to go to. He became an Army Ranger. At the time, I don't know if there's any sense, he was the only guy to be an Army Ranger and a Navy SEAL, right? It's rare. And it's not that they don't have the skill set to get, like Rangers go to SEAL school, they rarely make it if they don't, because in one way you're like, I've already been through this. Why would I want to do that, right? But anyway, he did that. And then he set the world record for pull-ups, right? He trained a little while, became world record for doing pull-ups. Took off one day, ran a 50-mile desert race in the heat without training, right? And then since a 100 mile, and then since he he went back in they had to get a waiver from the military at 50, 51, I think. He went back in the Air Force and requalified for special operations for the Air Force, right? So that's a guy that's like, he's motivating, but is that a realistic upward comparison, right? And then, of course, in our world, we have Tony Robbins, the peak performance guy. You know, uh, people want to be, they still kind of, not like they did 20 years ago. Oh, I want to be the next Tony Robbins, right? Uh, and he's the only person in our world of coaching, NLP, and hypnosis that's truly a billionaire, right? But I always stress to when this came up at the conference, I was talking to somebody, well, you realize the NLP, the hypnosis and coaching and his, destiny schools and all the stuff that he does is not a moneymaker for him. That's not what made him a multimillionaire, now billionaire, right? He owns all these businesses, Quest Labs, Twin Labs, he buys businesses that are in bankruptcy and turns them around, right? And then he produces movies. Anyway, it's neither here nor there. But then, we'll see, oh, he's making all this money from the seminars. There's 3,000 people in the room. Dr. John was in the call. He could tell you a lot of those, because he worked for him for a while. When it was all said and done, some of those big talks between 4,000 and 8,000 people actually broke even on just what people paid to get in. The money was in the upsells. And he was smart enough to use it as he's looking for entrepreneurs that want a joint venture with him, right? Because I know a couple people I met when I was going to a couple of his things, they did that. They signed up and ventured with Tony. On day one, you give Tony Robbins 50% of your business and all future income, right? I say that to people, well, I'd never do that. Well, I don't know about you, but I would. He's got the track record, the system. Anyway, but this is upward comparison, which may not, be very successful, right? And it lowers your self-esteem, right? And usually those are one-off things, it's and a lot of times those upward mobilely, the people we compare ourselves to, they've accomplished this goal because if you get really honest, and Mark Cuban's like that, really honest, they were in the right place at the right time. It was luck. You can't discount luck. But then a lot of the people, when they make it, it becomes something who they are. Anyway, that's a talk for another day. That's the black swan experience, right? That's why we see these things. Every billionaire gets up at 5 a.m. and does this, and this. So I'll sell you a program on how to think like used to be Branson or whoever it was. They put that out there, and it sounds good because you're trying to do it. But the fact of the matter is, if you're in NLP, all billionaires, not necessarily. Richard Branson was a night owl. We all know Tony Robbins is a night owl. They're not up at 5 a.m. unless they haven't went to bed yet, right? But we're looking for easy answers, right? But what really happens now is with this upward comparison is what social media has done, right? People will post the best days of their lives, and you're having one of the worst days of your life, and you'll compare it to someone else's best day, right? Or we don't even know it's true. And as you all know, if you've been on a few of my calls, I yell at people if they only put up pictures that are filtered. It's like, and I was teaching this at the conference, and somebody said, well, what's wrong with that? And I go, well, because, I got in trouble one time teaching because somebody goes, oh, yeah, well, here, look at my social media. And I looked at their picture. What is this, your high school picture? I don't want to hurt you, but that's, if Albert was on the call, the agent, the one way to destroy your acting career is not have a headshot or a picture that actually looks like you. Not how you look in full stage makeup. They can picture that. They want to, you know, but it's like, you know, we compare upward by default and it can set unreasonable expectations, right? And sometimes you're comparing yourself to things that you really can't even comprehend. You know, every once in a while somebody go, we'll be working on prosperity and they'll go, I want to be a billionaire. Um, and I think it's Victoria Gallagher who teaches law of attraction. She says, wait a minute, whoa, can you even imagine what a billion is? You know, what do you make now? Let's just say you're six figures. You know, a billion is a million or 1,000 million, right? And if you're making 100 grand, that it's numbers you can't comprehend. Same with when you look at a David Goggins, unless you got that genetic thing where you could do some of the things he did, yeah, or Dr. Johnny Kim. It's probably easier to go to Stanford, Harvard, become an astronaut when your IQ's in the 160 range. And he has discipline, which sometimes super smart people don't have the discipline, right? I remember they were interviewing him. He said, well, the hardest thing was when he got to SEAL school, it was the first time, or SEAL training, it was the first time in his life that he may be one of the smartest people there, but it wasn't going to get him ahead. He had to work, right? And how many times have we seen like family members, and we'll say that they have such potential, you know? It's like, well, yeah, potential is one step away from living in a van down by the river, if you're old enough to remember the old Saturday Night Live skit, right? So where omission and comparison meet is leaves a self-worth deficit, excuse me. Yeah, I speak for a living, with no explanation attached, right? And it shows you proof every day of why you're behind. Because you're comparing yourself to that. Well, they're doing this. Well, okay, right? And they feed each other in a loop. And it gets into that not being good enough. Nothing I do is good enough, which leads to perfectionism. And perfectionism will stop all success, right? As Bill Gates said once, as he had some engineers when they were putting stuff out, he's like, just put it out where there's still bugs. Who cares? We need to get it out. We can fix it later. But how many people I talk to people who go, I want to write a book. Okay, have you written a book? Yeah, it's just I'm editing it. How long have you been editing it? 2 years. Just publish the thing, right? Because it'll never be perfect, you know. Um, and then they eventually both get read as that's just how I am. It's not just something that happened to me, or they had this, I had that. It's just if I'm not doing good enough, it's because of something I am, you know. And again, with the social media, we compare ourselves to unrealistic expectations, and sometimes we even buy into the myth. Oh, so and so started with nothing. I won't name a name, but Elon Musk. Well, it helps if your parents owned emerald mines in South Africa, right? I mean, it's like, or Bill Gates, his mother was vice president of IBM. So when he had the idea and anyway, you know, but again, they internalize it, make it special. And to do this, to make these changes, I don't want to say it's easier to work with a single traumatic scene of commission, something happening to you. This is a little different. There's no discrete movie to run backwards, right? They live at the level of belief and identity, not just an incident, right? And so you have to break that down. And if you have it, if you have some of that, I'm not good enough, or I see people do it all the time. They beat themselves up for not knowing that something that there's no reason they should know it. Right? If you don't know, you don't know what you don't know, right? And what is it they say? There's known knowns, there's known unknowns if you're doing something, right? And then I think it was Rumsfeld coined the term the unknown unknowns. There's things you don't know that you don't even know you don't know until till it happens, you know. And one is on omission, right? Is the absence of love that your mother, your father, or teachers do it to kids. You're just stupid. You'll never get. Girls aren't good at math. Whatever it is, the absence of love, care, nurturing, I should expand that, or support was never proof of your worth. It was proof of what your caregivers didn't have to give. Right? And on comparison, the best thing we can do, and we say this a lot, is compare yourself to who you were yesterday. Not a stranger's highlight reel. I could do 20 push-ups really clean the other day, right? Well, I couldn't do that before. It took a couple of weeks to get back into doing that, right? Don't compare that to, David Goggins doing 250 consecutive push-ups, right? The only fair yardstick is who you were before. So I hope this makes sense to everybody. And the trap hiding in our own field is this whole idea of the multi-million-dollar a year coach or therapist. If you're on Facebook, we see it all the time. And first of all, we don't know if it's true. There's no metric that you don't have to prove that if you're making $1 million a year if you go online and say it, right? I know back 20 years ago when I was doing practice building, I'd be at these conferences and people be talking, oh, I'll show you how to build a practice. And in fact, I stole this from someone. It was Scott McFall, I'll be honest, which is, so I'm pitching Bruce, right? Bruce, I can show you how to build a practice. Well, a lot of people here can't. Well, here's the difference. Here's my tax returns, right? I'll show them to you. This is what I made. Yes, this is what I spent. That one year I made $484,000 in my clinic. But I'll be honest, I spent $200,000 in advertising and another $60,000 in expenses and, had people working for me. But I laid it out. So it's like there was a metric because it's easy to stand there and say, and I see it at conferences and just like Facebook, oh, I have this booming practice, right? Do you really? I hope you do, but plus if it's that busy, and I would always say, well, this is from a couple years ago because if I'm coaching people, I don't have time to run this kind of business and coach you, right? So anyway, that's what, and again, it's the same mechanism, omission or commission or comparison. It's a different yardstick, right? And you can't take the statistically irrelevant and make it normal. I mean, just watching a thing and then I'll shut up because I thought it was funny. They were talking about a football coach at a school, at college, big time college, and he's getting a lot of success. And somebody said, well, what's your thing? He goes, well, the first thing I do is walk in and tell everybody the chances of you playing pro football is low. You may play big time college ball, but one out of 100 of those guys make it to the pros, right? And how easy it'd be to like come in and say, I'll get you to the pros, right? But if you compare yourself to the outliers, you're always going to fall short. And again, as Seneca said, a satisfying life is more fulfilling than a successful life. Because again, what's the success metric? Is it money, right? And if we could all agree with one thing, because from the outside looking in, people are just going like, what's wrong with Jeff Bezos or Zuckerberg? Or Gates is kind of out of the picture, but Bezos, Zuckerberg, Musk, right? Don't they have enough? Well, again, they're comparing themselves to other billionaires, not to us, right? And if you got in that group, you'd start comparing yourself to that group. I heard an actor give a talk where he talked about he had a couple big successes, got in some big movies, and he started chasing that. Right. And then he went back to doing little movies and Broadway and this and that, right? Because that's, it wasn't fulfilling, it wasn't satisfying for him anymore. Right. And he goes, you get around certain actors talk about what the box office of their last movie was, and other actors would talk about how satisfying it was to do that role. And they didn't even know the box office, if that makes sense to everybody. And again, I'll close with why, if you fall into that trap, you always want more. It's called the hedonic response. We know that from the addiction world. You always want more. And so the reference group changes. So anyway, that's just a little bit of what the hedonic response with all this is, and it's having fun with it, and the acts of omission, commission, and comparison. So go to hortonpsychology.com if you want more information, and have a great day.